Most ideas you're not going to know in a month whether it's a loser or a winner. You're going to have to stick with it longer than that to find out if it's a good product or not. And you're really going to kind of have to commit to it, right?
My guest today is Kevin Dietz. He's an entrepreneur and software engineer who's spent most of his life developing for developers, coming up with ways to make software development easier and making it easier for large teams to manage large projects. He's had many successes in his career, including acquisitions of his software that he's developed. He developed Software Edge, which was acquired by Intersolve in 1995, and Sher Inc., which was acquired by Serena Software in 2003. He's done many, many other things. Most recently, he was working with Atlassian on their product Confluence, which is a major player in the software documentation field. Now he's working on his own software documentation platform called Open Squiggly. You can learn more about Open Squiggly at opensquiggly.com, where you can sign up for early access and be one of the first to try out this new software that's going to modernize the way software documentation is done. If you want to see more of Kevin after watching this, you can find him on his YouTube channel, The Stoic Developer, where he discusses a really interesting intersection of Stoic philosophy and the life of a software development. I personally really enjoy his channel, and I think you will too. So, Kevin, I think a good piece of background knowledge before we have this conversation could be, for some of our viewers who aren't acquainted, why don't you tell us what software documentation is and why it's important?
Let me give a quick anecdote from a long distant past, and hopefully it'll make some sense. So a long time ago when I was in college, I was working as an intern at IBM. And there was a bunch of different interns that worked on different projects, and we all had our own managers and our own teams. But our managers wanted us to work on a project together, and so that we could learn about taking initiative and working on something of our own design. So we got together as the interns, probably half a dozen of us or so, and said, okay, what's the problems? What do we what do we see here? And so what we identified as a problem was, it's just kind of hard to find everything, right? You come in as an intern, there's tools that you're supposed to download, forms, documentation, and things are kind of scattered all over the place. And I'm talking about 30 some odd years ago now, right? But if you fast forward to today, the same exact problem still exists in corporate America, and especially in software development in corporate America, that it's still too hard to find technical information about what you're doing, right? Developers, they want to stay in the flow, right? When you're developing and you're coding, you want to keep your mind in that flow. And anything that takes you outside of that flow is going to impact your productivity. So developers spend an inordinate amount of their day looking up technical information, to whether it's an API, whether it's external dependencies, the database schema, something they need to know about the database schema, the DevOps system, whatever. And so they're always trying to find this information. So there's two ways you can get that information, right? Two basic ways you can get that information. One is if somebody was kind enough to write some documentation to describe, the database schema or whatever it is you're looking for. So in this case,
it's like a handbook that like accompanies some code.
Well, I'm talking about internal documentation for the team, let's say.
Sure.
All the technical details about the project that you're working on. That's primarily what we're working on, is internal team documentation, not something that you publish to end users or something
Gotcha.
like that, but internal technical documentation for the team. And so you can either find what you're looking for through a document, or a lot of times the document doesn't exist, right? Either the document doesn't exist, you don't know how to find it, or if the documentation does exist, then it's out of date and it's not reliable. So a lot of times you have to resort to looking in the source code and just reading the source code and reverse engineering the source code to glean the technical information that you need. So the tool that we're working on brings both of those things together. Documentation, which could be in the form of markdown files, HTML files, things that a human would write, or it could be reference type documentation like, for example, API documentation or Java doc or JS doc or Swagger documentation for API documentation. It could be auto-generated from the source code, right? Or the source code itself. If something's not documented adequately, then I need to dive into the source code. So really, that's kind of how we're thinking about it with this tool that we're working on. High-level architecture documents, mid-level, reference-level documentation, and then the lowest level of information, source code, bringing all that together into a single place, into a single pane of glass, I like to say, right? So I have all that at my disposal. I'm there as a developer. I'm working on code, and I can have my browser up, and I need to look up database schema, whatever, boom. I can... So on the left-hand side of the tool is a single unified document tree that I can drill in and explore. If I don't know exactly what I'm looking for, I can drill in and kind of
logically find your path there.
Yeah, drill down and find what I'm looking for. If I do have some idea of what I'm looking for, then I can go to the search bar across the top and I can search for it, and the tool will bring up all the documents and all the source code, and I can specify. I can narrow the search down and things like that, but bringing it all together into one place is what we're going for.
So one thing you just mentioned was like you kind of mentioned it in passing here, but like auto-generated documentation. To what degree, and just because we haven't mentioned it yet, the name of the software that Kevin's creating is Open Squiggly.
Right.
To what degree will Open Squiggly be auto-generating documentation, or am I just not aware that that's something that's already being done?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big part of what we're going for with the tool. So there are things like Swagger and other what are called static site generators out there that will either scan let's say your Markdown files and build up a document site for you, or in the case of things that are generated from source code, it will scan the source code and then produce a set of documentation for you. So those are static site generators. Now what we want to do is we want to take that idea and make it a live auto-updating system. So instead of statically generating your documents and then taking those now what do you do with them once you generate your static documents? You got to put them somewhere, right? You got to deploy them on, some web server somewhere that would allow you to deploy the pages. But that's a pretty high friction type of workflow, really. You require DevOps, and you got to think about your build server. You got to think about where you're going to deploy the sites. There might be some permissions and privileges and access rights you have to go if you're a developer trying to set all this stuff up. It's a pretty high friction thing. So what we want to do is make it much easier for the developers to get that kind of end result, but not have to statically generate it, to just be able to connect. I just connect it to GitHub. I connect it to my GitHub account. I connect it to my Bitbucket account, whatever. I build out my documentation tree, and once I've configured it, and I can constantly tweak this too as I go. So if I change my mind about where I want to put a piece of documentation or where I want it located in the table of contents, I can move things around really easily. And then so I just connect it to my sources, and then the system keeps it up to date live, right? So it's this live auto-updating dynamic system that gives you the same kind of end result as a static site generator. Now, the things like Swagger and things like that, we'll be integrating with those things. That's the idea. So we'll Swagger's open source, for example. So we can use some of these open source projects and integrate with the existing specifications like Swagger. That will be something we'll integrate with, and then it will do a dynamic processing of your source files to dynamically produce your Swagger API documentation, for example. So, but it's all live and all dynamic.
It sounds like it takes a lot of weight off the shoulders of engineers too. Just that's going to save them a ton of time.
Yeah, exactly. It's really about focusing on the developers, making it a very friction-free process. A lot of these things I just described in a big corporate environment, those are actually pretty difficult things to do. Like oh yeah, I'm just going to deploy some static files out somewhere. Where? Like, where am I going to put them? I need to go talk to somebody and get somebody to sign off on that and get some get a AWS login ID and some credentials. And I have to do all this stuff. So it's a really a pretty high friction thing to do that. So we're really trying to make it where, it just lowers the barrier to entry on this very significantly, so that people have fun doing this. It can people enjoy writing documentation or maintaining their technical information in their documents, and that it's a fun process for developers, really focusing on the needs of developers.
So in one of your YouTube videos, you talked about how you would rate software development as an industry as kind of poor in culture in terms of helping developers, progress themselves personally and like develop their skill sets and, personal development, I think was the term you used. And then you also mentioned that the tool that you were working on, might help to alleviate some of that or improve it. I'd love to know how you see those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about, some of my more recent employment experiences over, let's say, the last 10 years or so. You go in, you walk into the office and it says on the wall, real developers ship, right? Like there's this constant pressure and emphasis on shipping and results and very much a focus on immediate results, right? I give you a bug, I expect you to fix that bug. I give you a user story, I expect your manager, right, is expecting you to deliver these kind of results quickly. And I understand that that's necessary, but sometimes I feel like there's something lost in that process, that there's a longer term arc of what we're trying to accomplish in the industry. It's more than about just getting this bug fixed today. Like, how about we don't create bugs, right?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Right. So what can we do to make the long-term arc of the project more maintainable? What can we do to help developers be more productive over the long term, not just get this one single bug fixed, hacked up no matter, right? There's a lot of encouragement to just hack code, right? Just put Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids until the thing just basically buckles over in its own weight. And then the other thing, too, is developers leave the company, right?
They hate working on that kind of thing.
Then they leave behind all this code that has all these Band-Aids all over it. And, then you come along and it's extremely difficult to be productive. So is there some way we can get past that, right? Yes, short-term results are important, but can we think about long-term maintainability of the project as well? And what I'm talking about with the tool I'm working on very much focuses on long-term maintainability of the software. We're maintaining the documentation as we go. We're keeping it up to date. The system is live updating itself, keeping it up to date. It's auto-generating things from the source code. And so we got a lot of really interesting, innovative things that features and workflows I will be putting into this tool that really fits right into that. And then, the career development of developers and happiness too, right? We want software development. It really can be an industry that really does sap your spirit from you if you let it, right? So what can we do to help developers be productive, be happy? The general vision I have is what I want is developers come into work at the beginning of the day. They have a clear understanding of what they're supposed to do. They have a clear understanding of how they're supposed to do it because they have access to the technical information they need right at their fingertips through the tool I'm working on. They get tons of valuable work done all day long, keeping their manager happy, right? And managers, they want results. And then they go home at the end of the day and they feel good about what they did, right? They can go home to their family and they can spend their evening hours with their family and they can feel good about it, and not spend their whole evening under this cloud of dread that, oh God, I didn't get didn't get that done today, thing. So that's the general vision, what we're going for, and something we're driving for with the tool I'm building.
You mentioned, a sapping nature of the industry sometimes. Do you think that that's where that comes from, is just like not being clear on what you're trying to do or if it's going to work, like it kind of eats away at you when you go home? Is that what you're describing there?
Yeah, definitely. I think kind of getting back to what I said a minute ago, that the code base, particularly on large code bases, right? And we're talking about, the last company I worked at, all kinds of different repositories. Across the entire company, there's probably 100,000 repositories, not lines of code, right? Repositories spread all over the place. Now, they weren't all related to the project I was working on, but there were a lot of repositories that were related to the project that I was working on that I didn't even know about, right? In some cases, I was asked to work on bug fixes that involved changes to code in repositories that I didn't even know existed.
And this isn't a small company either. This is a fairly sizable software organization.
Yeah, 3,000 or 4,000 developers spread across the company, right? So, that kind of like you're drinking out of a fire hose. Your manager is, putting all this pressure on you to produce. You're going into work every day. You're swimming in information, or what you're really swimming in is a lack of information, right? It's not so much drinking out of the fire hose. It's like you're trying to get the fire hose to start spitting water out of there, right? That just cumulatively, it adds up, and, you just start to have this kind of very dark cloud of, it becomes not very fun pretty quickly, right? And that's what we're trying to avoid. Like, we want developers engaged, we don't want that kind of feeling on the project, right? We want developers excited. We want them engaged. And having access to that technical information is very much part of it. Being able to connect the dots, right? This is another thing I think about a lot. I want to connect the dots when I go into a company, and I want to think about what I'm working on now, but I also want to think maybe a little bit more strategically and a little bit longer term. I want to be able to connect the dots, but how do I connect the dots if I don't even know what the dots are that are to be connected, right? So, like, there's a part of this where I have to have some visibility. Developers have to have the visibility to have those kind of insights, connect those kind of dots. Again, this fits very much in with the theme of the tool that we're working on. Create that visibility.
So to zoom out and go macro for a little bit here, your career has really been marked by you developing for developers.
Absolutely.
So yes, I'd love to know, from a business perspective, or, I guess, what is the overall motivation for staying in that niche for, is it 20 years now that you've been?
25, 30 years now, for sure. So I started my career at Hewlett-Packard, and I was a software developer there, and this is, back in the day, early 90s, so a long time ago, and there wasn't a lot of tooling at that time in terms of what we know today, software development, lifecycle tools. At Hewlett-Packard, we had a very primitive command line-based defect tracking system, and that, it was pretty obvious from using that tool that it could be made so much better, right? And
the entrepreneurial spark.
Yeah, so that gets the gears to, the creative gears flowing in you, and you think, wow, you have all these ideas for how you can make that better. We can have integrated reporting. We can have integrated workflows, and user-specific permissions that let you change the right things and not change the wrong things, and that kind of thing. So I teamed up with a couple of friends of mine, and we were early pioneers in defect tracking. We had a company called the Software Edge, and we made, as far as I know, it was the first defect tracking system that was available on the Windows platform back in the early 90s. And then I went on, after we sold that company a couple of years later, I went on to found Sher, which we made Team Track, which was really one of the first, or if not the very first, web-based defect tracking system. So the web had kind of come into its own, and so that kind of cemented those early experiences, cemented that interest in software development tools, software development lifecycle tools, and productivity tools. And then I think the rest of my career is just kind of built on that, where of course, as a software developer myself, right, I have these pains, I have these frustrations, and I talk to other developers that have these same pains and frustrations. And at Hewlett-Packard, they had this thing called Next Bench, the Next Bench workflow, which meant you develop a product for the guy at the next bench, right? The guy at the next bench, he needs an oscilloscope. So the guy, so you're developing for, what does your fellow engineers need, and that can be a good source of innovation in entrepreneurship when you start thinking about, hey, what do the people around me need in tools, and how can we make this better? And that just fit into my way of thinking. And so I've just always, it's fun, it's interesting. There's a lot of creative things to do in the space. Software projects keep getting bigger and more complex. That's another one of our big themes for developing this product. And so we're trying to trying to close the gap a little bit. The underlying theory is that software project complexity has risen faster than the existing tools that have been built over the last 20 or 30 years to keep up with it. So kind of the gap between what you need and what you have keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So we're trying to do something to close that gap. We'll see. I think we can make a pretty big dent in it.
I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
So you've done it in not just a software sense too, though. Your YouTube channel has been created content that's for developers as well. So it's interesting as well. It's cool to see that it's a passion that extends beyond engineering for you, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. So the channel is called the Stoic Developer. It's a new channel, still early days. Don't have very many subscribers yet. It definitely fits in with the theme. There is, so I got interested in Stoic philosophy a few years ago. I was working with a life coach, a business coach, his methodology was very much oriented around self-awareness, right? And so he had developed all of these self-awareness exercises and that kind of stuff. And so you would work through, every week we would work through one of the exercises. And at first I didn't really quite get what he was doing, and I thought, when are we going to get done with all these dumb self-awareness exercises and get to the real stuff? And then eventually it dawned on me that was the real stuff. But anyways, through that experience of working with him, I got, became exposed to Stoic philosophy, which is very much related to that self-awareness, those self-awareness aspects. And so I've learned a lot about Stoicism over the last few years, and I wanted to combine. There aren't a lot of channels I know out there that combine sort of Stoic ideas specifically to software developers, to applying those ideas specifically to the software development lifestyle. So that's what the channel's about, trying to take some ideas that are talked about in Stoic philosophy, but then put them in a context of, okay, how do I use that as a software developer?
How do you use that as a software developer? I mean, I know that's what your entire channel's about, so I'm asking you to summarize a little bit too much here, but I mean, in broad strokes, like what do you think the intersection looks like?
Right. Well, it's a lot of, Stoicism has a lot of tools in it. Like, for example, one of the focuses in Stoicism is what's inside your control and what's outside your control, trying to make this discernment between inside your control and outside your control. And it also has other practices like negative visualization and preparedness and things like that. But let's just focus on, make sense if I gave an example.
Sure.
Like, suppose you go into a one-on-one meeting, or no, let's say it's not a one-on-one meeting. Suppose you go into a meeting with your manager, and there's the rest of the team there, and suppose you get a public reprimand in the meeting, right? A public reprimand. You're not supposed to do that as a manager,
that's a
right?
big
Every business book that I know of says never do a public reprimand, right? You do it in private, whatever. But let's just say that you're on the receiving end of a public reprimand. What do? Right? So like, how can you use your Stoic skills, and how can you separate out like what's inside my control, what's outside my control, as well as maybe being prepared, thinking through, how would I handle a public reprimand if that happened? And that has happened to me a couple of times.
Really?
Yeah. And so the best method that I've come up with, and I'll probably do a YouTube channel or a YouTube top video specifically about public reprimands, but I got to it's only happened a couple of times, but you say, you're bringing up some good points, but I think we should take this up continue this in a one-on-one, right? So kind of deflecting the energy,
control the situation, get it into less chaotic
and controlling your emotions too, like, because you can, like when that happens, like, you
feel it in your stomach.
Yeah. So giving developers those kind of emotional management tools, and then talking about them specifically as they relate to specific situations that might come up in a software development situation, thinking about those things, being cognizant about those things, and we'll see how it goes, and hopefully we can produce some content that people find useful.
Sweet. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, in some of your earlier projects, you've had these successful exits where you've sold the company off. That's something that's kind of looked at as a benchmark of success, in software development, in entrepreneurship, whatever it is, having a successful exit from a company. How early on in these ventures do you start thinking about that, or is that just a happy coincidence if you do everything else right?
Looking back on it, I think it wasn't the absolute 100% best timing in both of my exits. In the first case, I was a co-founder of the company. I wasn't the majority shareholder, and it was really the other shareholders that were looking more for a quick exit. I probably would have been. We sold the company after only 2 years, which really in hindsight I think was a mistake, because we were doing very well and we were growing rapidly. And I think if we had let the clock run on that a little bit longer, that we could have made a lot more money and set ourselves up. As it is, we all made some money, but we certainly didn't make enough money to set ourselves up for life or anything like that. But it was really more, I wasn't the majority shareholder, and I went along with it, but it probably wouldn't have been my personal choice to sell it that early. The second company, the second company, so there were some timing issues that happened there. This is back right around 2000. We had raised.
Did you own the whole company?
I was a majority shareholder in that company, but I didn't own the whole thing. And we had gone out and raised some money from venture capitalists, and we raised money like a week before the dot-com bubble burst. So we got kind of lucky in the sense that we had raised money like right before the dot-com bubble burst in March of 2000. And then, but then because of the dot-com bubble burst, our sales had, we weren't growing as fast. Our sales had kind of flattened out. And then, we had some disagreements, some strategic disagreements in the company and things like that. And we eventually sold the company in 2003, so about 3 years after we had raised that first round of financing. So there it was probably more, some issues around strategic direction of the company, and the investors having different ideas, and the company wasn't as growing as fast as they wanted it to because of the dot-com. Oh, and then 9/11 happened too, right? So we had a double whammy. You had the dot-com bubble burst, and then you had 9/11, and so that's what happened there. And I think by the end, we all just kind of wanted to get out and go our separate ways.
That was like a 7-8 year project, right?
Yeah. So I started in '96, and we sold it in 2003. So that was about 7 years. And so I think
big company too.
Well, we were about 120 people at our peak. So I mean, to me that's pretty big coming from where I've come from, right? It's not 3,000 or 4,000, but it was pretty sizable. And then we had done some downsizing from our peak before we sold the company. But yeah, it was a pretty sizable effort. We were definitely one of the top leading players in web-based defect tracking system in the early 2000s. We had major clients everywhere, Hewlett Packard, Dell, and a whole bunch of other big Fortune 100, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies, and lots of small companies too. So it was definitely a significant significant ongoing concern. And if we could have worked our way through some of the problems, then we might have been. When I originally started Team Sher, I wanted it to be the thing I would do for the rest of my life.
Really?
Yeah, that was my goal there, and didn't work out that way. So, and then in the intervening years, I've had ideas for other projects, and that didn't quite get the traction that those first two ventures got. And so now, I've scratched and clawed my way back, and ready for one more go around at this. This one, will I sell it right away? Will I grow it for a few years? Will it be the thing I keep and run forever? I'm pretty open, pretty flexible, actually. I'm older now, so I'm not against the idea of selling it and exiting it. I do want it to be like, if I do sell it this time, like, it has to be like for an amount of money that I really truly am set up for life.
Yeah.
Right? When you're younger, you see a number on a piece of paper and it looks like a lot of money, and then you realize it really wasn't that much money. It really wasn't enough to live. When you sell a company when you're 29 years old, and you think, if you lived to 70, 80, 90, 100 years old, right? Like, it's not enough to live for 70, 80, 90 years on, right?
Right.
So, this time, if I do sell it, it'd be for an amount that I can retire on.
So at what point in your career did it change from like bug tracking software to issue handling to software documentation? Because it seems like when I'm just looking through your past work experiences, there's like a slow shift that started to happen at a certain point.
Yeah. So after Team Sher, one of the things I worked on was continuous integration and build management, that kind of thing. And that kind of got me into, if you think about static site generators and generating documentation with a continuous integration server, you can kind of see how maybe that sort of segues into what I'm doing now. This idea that you're something that triggers when you do a check-in, and it triggers a build process, and the build process is going to run your builds and everything like that. Well, how about it builds your documentation for you? Is kind of part of it. After that, I did some interesting work around automated merges in version. So I was working with version control, and was thinking a lot about how to automate the merging process in heavily branched environments in version control. I have always been interested in documentation, though, even going back to when I was an intern at Hewlett Packard and getting exposed to some early documentation systems like LaTeX, which is built on top of Donald New's text processing system. So I've always been interested in that, and then I've always had this passion for developer productivity. So taking all of those experiences together, the work I did on continuous integration, the work I did in version control, and really, if you think about it, what is defect tracking other than a specialized type of document management system, right? It's a document management system that's geared towards a specific purpose. A defect, you could say, that is a document. And so really, I think culminating all of that together, all of these different interests and threads in my life kind of, merged together into this venture. So
it does seem like that, for sure. So if I can ask about this, so how did your time at Atlassian working on Confluence Cloud, how did that lead you to either changing the vision that you had for Open Squiggly, or how did it impact what Open Squiggly is going to be?
So Confluence is an authoring system, right? It's a wiki, and it's, as wikis go, it's a pretty decent one, I guess. And it's got macros and other plugins and things like that. So it has a richer ecosystem than other wikis do out there. But what if I don't want to author documents in the wiki? Like, what if I want my documents to live as markdown files in my source code? What if I want to version them along with Git? Now what do I do? Now I'm, so Confluence is good for authoring internal documentation. So that, and by the way, I had all this was the core ideas for Open Squiggly I had thought about before I went to Atlassian, and I had written them down on my invention disclosure when I went to Atlassian, in case anybody wonders about that.
Nice.
Right.
Good move.
So some things, depending on who the stakeholder is involved, sometimes it does make sense to author a document in something like a wiki, right? But then other times, if it's depending on how developer focused it is, and depending on what the life cycle of that documentation you want to have and where you want to version it, if you want it to live alongside the
source code,
alongside the source code in your Git repository, now what you have is two separate documentation environments, right? You've got the stuff in Confluence, and you've got the stuff in your Markdown files in your source code.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now I got to go to two places, right? Like so we want one place that can bring it together. And then also Confluence really doesn't have a solution for reference documentation, right? I mean, like I want auto-generated Swagger API documentation, and how do I get that into Confluence, right? There's no method to do that, right? So there's nothing that I know of out there at Confluence or anything else that pulls together high-level architect documents that could be authored either internally or stored externally, right? That plus mid-level reference documentation that's auto-generated like Swagger, plus source code, all pulled together with a unified documentation tree and a unified search engine, so a single search, I can search for anything, and that keeps it live, updated, so I don't have to set up a static site generator and deploy my files and all that. There's no system I know out there that does that, and I've spent a lot of time asking developers. I've said, tell me this tool and I'll use it, right? And everyone I ask says they don't know of any tool that does anything like that. And so just talk to developers. I've tried to validate. I try to do the lean startup thing, and I try to talk to developers. And
that's my next question, actually.
and validate. I have my reservations about lean startup, but the validation, and wanting to have confidence that what you're working on is going to be well received by your audience. I have done that to the extent possible. I feel like I've done that as much as conceivably possible, other than just building the darn thing, right? So that's kind of where I'm at.
How did you do it? Did you just go ask developers?
Yeah,
did you show them prototypes?
A lot of it's just, I've done all of that. Some of it's just ad hoc conversations. I've gone back to my friends, even before I worked at Atlassian. Developers I know from my former life and that kind of stuff, from Team Sher and other projects and things like that. And I've had sit-down conversations. I've bought people lunch. I've walked them through the ideas. And now we have the website, that we've done, and we've got these ideas prototyped. We have a video out there that was done by a technical writer at Google that discusses a lot of the same ideas that what I'm talking about building. But it's an internal tool at Google. It's not something you can buy, and it's not open source. So we have that video out there on the Open Squiggly website.
That tool is
G3 Doc.
G3 Doc.
Yeah.
So what are the differences between that and Open Squiggly?
So I don't know a lot about G3 Doc. I've never worked at Google. I don't have personal access to it. And I'd love to learn more about it if Riona will ever call me back. Maybe she'll see this video and she'll give me a call.
I'll do what I
can. But it does sound, the tool that she's describing in that video does sound very similar. She's
awesome.
Talking about how you can connect, they wanted to connect their engineering doc web server to their source code repository so that it could get the Markdown files in and deploy the Markdown files out to a well-defined, well-known URL.
That almost feels like some level of validation. Like the fact that Google's doing it?
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty cool.
Exactly. One of the next things on my plate is to do an explain video that will kind of summarize the idea that she's talking about on that video, and put it into life and put that out onto the website. That will be more validation. Now that we have the website, we can send that to prospective clients, send it to prospective investors, circle back around to other people I have talked to and get their feedback on it. Now that it has a little bit more of a concrete form and you can read it in writing instead of me just describing it to you, and then continuing to develop the product as well. So getting it to the point that we have a first version of the product to go out and get some users.
That's my next question too. So how are you planning on getting users? Like what's your go-to-market strategy, and as much detail as you feel like sharing?
Yeah. A lot of online marketing one way or the other.
That's where developers live.
I have, of course, I have my own LinkedIn network, and I can reach out directly to people and continue to do interviews and marketing to people through interviews, and then some of those people maybe will express interest and want to join the early access program and use the product, and we'll probably do some YouTube, sponsor some YouTube channels. Nice. And that kind of stuff, because there are a lot of YouTube channels out there that do target software developers. There aren't that many YouTube channels that target Stoic philosophy and software development combined into one channel, but there are a lot of YouTube channels that target software developers, and some of them are really quite popular. They have millions of, in many cases, hundreds of thousands or over 1 million subscribers.
Like those ex-Google guys.
Yeah,
I've seen some of those.
Yeah. And so I could see myself maybe doing some video sponsorship there, and just other types of online marketing. And so it'd be a combination of sort of direct one-on-one marketing, me calling people and asking them for feedback and walking them through the product, and driving traffic to the website using various online marketing. I mean, that's why the website's very important to get that up. So we have a landing page when people come to it that they can learn more about the product, and they can sign up for the early access program.
Definitely. So in your 2 earlier startups, how did you do it?
So it was a different world back then.
Definitely.
It was a very different world. So I tell you that it's amazing. You wouldn't believe it. It's a great story. I'm glad you asked me. Back then, there was a software development magazine, or programming magazine, or software development magazine, and a physical print magazine, right, that they'd send.
Yeah.
And they did what was called a card deck. You're maybe too young to remember what a card deck is. Okay?
I don't even know what a card deck is.
A card deck is a set. A card deck is a stack of index cards that have ads on them, okay? And they're cellophane wrapped together and mailed out to all the subscribers of the magazine. So in the software development magazine probably had 70,000 subscribers or something like that, right? So you would pay, I think we paid $3,000, $4,000 in that neighborhood, something, a few thousand, but not, it was doable, right? And for a small startup. Paid $3,000 or $4,000 for a card in the card deck, and they would get mailed out to the 70,000 subscribers, and you would not believe the response rate, both in Software Edge and TeamShare. That was our first ad that we did, and in both cases they were massive home runs.
That's insane.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leads that we got off of this tiny little index card in this card deck, and it's a high price product in the sense that you sell a 50 developer thing, and it's $500 per developer, so like a $25,000 sale. I think our average site revenue, first sale was probably $10,000 or $15,000, but still, when you think about a $4,000 ad that generates hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leads, which has the potential to, some percentage of those can get converted into $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 sales, it can make for a pretty good economic situation. Those days are long gone, okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Those days are long gone. In the past, I've tried Google AdWords and didn't have much success with Google AdWords. That was
tricky.
Probably 10 or 15
especially in your
years
industry.
ago.
It's going to be so. What are the people going to search? Like, they don't even know that they need that there's a solution for their problem.
Yeah, that's why I think there has to be a discovery thing. That's why I think sponsoring YouTube channels could be a good way for developers who are watching something else, and then they discover this tool.
Have you ever tried cold email?
Not yet, but I probably will. So we'll probably do. Yeah,
that could be cool. I could see that working for
do some email lists.
Just
and
buy
that
some
kind of
lists.
stuff. Yeah,
Yep.
we'll definitely do that too. And
Cool idea.
Again, driving traffic to the website, things like that. But yeah, those Software Edge and Team Share, I mean, it was just amazing. It's not repeatable today at all.
No.
I remember the CEO of the company at Software Edge, and we were just working out of his house, right? And we all worked late and everything like that, and so we would take up all the leads, and we'd have a fulfillment package, an actual fulfillment package with a CD and everything like that. This is nothing like how things are done today, but an actual like envelope. And so we would prepare, all the things would come in at the afternoon mail would come, and we'd get all these index cards that would be sent back to us with the contact information. We'd prepare the outgoing mail, and every single day we'd have a giant stack of these things, and we'd drive them down to the last open post office in the city that closed at 12 midnight, and which was it was all the way down at the south end of Colorado Springs, and him and I would drive down every single night for the 12 o'clock mail drop to send out these fulfillment packages. It was just amazing. Like it's just something that's, unfortunately, it's not, that kind of excitement is not quite repeatable again today, but that was definitely a fun time.
What is Timpani Software and Clients?
Okay, so I mentioned the build management, continuous integration software that I had done after we sold TeamShare. That was my the venture that I had attempted it, and we never really got off the ground with that product. But we had originally it was a continuous integration product. It was originally called Drumbeat CI. The idea that Drumbeat, a cadence for your consistently developing, kicking off your build every time you did a check-in. So that kind of done, like Drumbeat was the idea.
It's got a similar kind of concept of like trying to keep developers in flow.
Yeah. So because the product was called Drumbeat, then timpani is a type of drum, right?
Okay.
Everybody, the name didn't really work so good because everybody thought we were some kind of music software or something like that,
Gotcha.
right? I knew the name timpani because like the old Jerry Lewis muscular dystrophy telethons, whenever they'd roll the thing, he'd always say, give me a timp, give me a timp, Ed, give me a timp, timpani, right? So I was kind of thinking about that, give me a timp, give me a timpani. And so that's kind of, otherwise I probably wouldn't have not even known what timpani was except for that. And then I thought about that sort of regular cadence, and so that led into Drumbeat, and then we renamed the product. I didn't like the name Drumbeat CI for some reason, although people told me after the fact that I should have stuck with that name because it was good. So then I renamed the product to BuildBeat, because I wanted it to be something that was like a build server. I wanted to have build in the name. So I changed from Drumbeat to BuildBeat. We had a couple of customers, but it's never really got traction. It's a pretty competitive space. The continuous integration server space was pretty competitive. And so then I started thinking about how can I use the technology to do something a little bit different? And that's when I got into this automated merging thing with another product called Merge Magician, which again never really got any traction. It turns out Merge Magician, I think, could have worked as a product. It was just going to be way too complex. It was just going to be, it was a very, very difficult, very complex product to build and to maintain all the different version control integrations. The idea was, as developers created branches in their version control system, to have a system that would automatically merge those branches back together so you could have a release candidate build of your thing. And so the world didn't really go that way, because the world now, this was kind of before the days of like pull requests and things like that. And so it used to be, if you wanted to do a merge, you kind of had to do the merge on your desktop, right? And that was the tools. This is before Git, and the tools were kind of clunky. It was kind of hard to do that. Now Git does make it easier, but also with the pull request concept, the merge does happen up on the server, right? Once you get your pull request approved and you hit the merge button, it's the server that does the merge. And that was a big part of what we were trying to do, to make the server do the merge and not have the developers have to actually do the merge locally and then push it up. So BuildBeat kind of segued into Merge Magician. And then from there, so the precursor to Open Squiggly is called Lots of Jots. And that was an idea that I'd been nurturing and working on for a long time. And it was basically, it was intended to be like sort of Evernote for developers. A way, because I found Evernote's a good product, okay, but it's not that great for developers. Like it has there's a lot of things that you want to try to document that are very difficult to document inside Evernote when you're trying to document technical information and things like that.
I didn't even know it was used in that context.
Yeah, I mean, some people,
Right.
some percentage of their user base are software developers, right? So what I had in mind was something like Evernote that would allow you to create more complex technical content and things like that. Actually, probably closer to Confluence.
I was just going to say, that sounds
Right.
familiar.
Sounds kind of like Confluence. So then, Buildbeat segued into Merge Magician. Merge Magician then was going to be too complex, so I started on Lots of Jots, and then now Lots of Jots. That is the core. The Lots of Jots code base is the basis for Open Squiggly. Right, so this is something I've been working on for a few years now, and so taking that, rebranding it to Open Squiggly, and making it be, so it still does internal authoring, right? Like a corporate wiki.
Sure.
Open Squiggly does support internal authoring of documents.
And just really quickly, why would someone want to have internal authoring that's separate from their code base?
Well, not everyone, it's just not right for all stakeholders, right? Like imagine that you're trying to bring in something that a product manager is going to write or something like that. A product manager, and they're not going to go and check markdown files into Git, right? Like that's just way too inconvenient. There's times where it's just too inconvenient to take the step to put things in Markdown and check them into Git and things like that. Imagine you just want to produce some documentation pretty quickly and you don't really have any place to put it that's very convenient in your, if you're a developer, you can maybe create a folder in your source code repository and put it in there. But, if you're a product manager or something like that, you're not going to know where to do it. So when you start bringing in other stakeholders, other dependencies, third-party documentation, or if you wanted to publish the documentation, there are various use cases where internal authoring is better. Okay, and then there's various other use cases where you want the documentation to live and be versioned alongside the source code, where checking Markdown files into Git is going to be better. And that use case is basically what G3Doc does, right? That Riona talks about in the video on our website. The ability to have the documentation live with the source code, and that's a big thing. But so what we're trying to do is do both, where you can have both internally authored documentation and externally hosted documentation all brought together into one place.
Are they all generated from the same file essentially? Like I'm envisioning, so there's a version of it that looks like G3 Markdown, and then you can view that same file like a front end facing version of it for, say, the marketing director.
Right. And so it would be, it all gets published to a well-defined URL for that particular document, right? So that Markdown file, once it runs through the Open Squiggly server, gets served up at a well-defined, predictable URL that you can then take that URL and send it around to people, and then you can see that particular file formatted, in the system. But then you have all the other documentation around it too, right? So it's a whole knowledge base. That's the thing about these tools that are different than Google Docs or something like that. I mean, Google Docs is about creating essentially one document, right? It's just like a file folder system for one document. But when you're talking about like a wiki, it's not just one document, right? That's one document in an entire context of surrounding other documents that are all part of a whole knowledge base of documents is what we're going for. So being able to do that with either internally authored documents or with externally hosted documents that get pulled in and then hosted, and now you've got everything there together in one system. That's the idea.
So what do you envision being like the smallest size company that Open Squiggly would be useful for? Is it only for companies like the ones that you've worked at where there's like hundreds or thousands of repositories, or do you think it'll be useful for startups that are just hitting the ground running and want to do things right from the get-go?
Yeah, definitely both. And I think it's a little bit about the sales cycle too. Like in a large company, probably there's two ways to sell it in a large company. One is you can just pick out one team and try to land inside one small team.
Could it be disjointed like that from the rest of the team?
It can be.
Okay.
Yeah, it can be. So that's one model, is a bottom-up sales approach inside a large organization. But another approach in a large organization would be more of a top-down type sale, where you go and you try to talk to the CTO and you talk about these high-level problems that we've been talking about here with the CTO, and you get the CTO to say, yeah, we really do have this problem big time here. We want to have an initiative, right? We want to have a cross-team initiative for the company, and so then we're going to bring in your tool, and then different teams are going to start using it. That's what Riona describes, and the way G3 Doc was deployed, right? It did start viral, but it started small and then it grew, right?
And then
to more
it became an initiative,
a larger initiative, and so certainly at that type of sales process, top down, it's going to be the larger companies, right? You're going to be going to a CTO of a few hundred people or whatever, and creating some kind of initiative across the company, but this can be useful for any size project and any size team. And in fact, it's actually better if you adopt it early when you are small.
Less initiatives.
Because then you can iterate on the system as you go. So basically the workflow that we're proposing is that when you start a project, you have the classic deliverable, right? The artifact that you're hosting, or the exe or whatever that you're going to ship, right? The deliverable of that project. That's one output of the team. So source code goes in, you have the team, and outputs come out the other end. One output is going to be your deliverables, but what we're proposing is that there should be a second deliverable for the team, and that what you should produce and maintain as you go is a knowledge base that allows you to maintain the software long term. Okay, so that's going to be your second thing, and then that's where Open Squiggly come in. Open Squiggly would fill that box, and so you can start small and then build it, and as your code base grows and grows and grows, you've been using Open Squiggly all along, and now the project's several years old and it's got millions of lines of code and thousands of repositories and whatever, but you've been maintaining it the whole time. See, so it definitely can start small. The other end, the big companies, that could be almost like, if it is a broader initiative in the company, it'd be more like firefighting. The CTO's, he just agrees with you. He says, "You're right, we're in deep doo-doo here. We've got developers that aren't anywhere near as productive as they should be. We've got thousands of repositories. We've got bugs. We've got crisis on our hands with operational, hot tickets and high severity hot tickets that are happening way too frequently for our customers to have confidence, and we need to get some kind of handle on this." And so there you're trying to solve the problem on an existing code base, and we're designing the product so it can be dropped in. You can take an existing code base and drop it into this tool very quickly, right? You connect it to the repositories, like I was saying. The system, when you first set it up, it'll scan the system for any existing markdown files it finds. You can rearrange your documents as you go. You don't need to get it perfect right away, right? You can rearrange them as you go. You can tweak it, and then eventually you've got something. Even though you started with a big, large code base, in relatively short order, you can have something fairly well organized. That's
Sure.
what we're going for there too. So, yeah, it does run a spectrum, I think.
So I know with development projects, this is like an impossible thing to answer accurately, but when do you think that this is going to be ready for consumers or for early access testing? Like what's the rough timeline right now?
I'm targeting to have a version 1.0 product out within 3 to 6 months.
Wow.
Now I do have some existing code that I have
true.
a code base that's that goes back several years that I'm using as the basis for this with the lots of Jots code base, and then in addition to that, I'm looking into engaging with an external software development team, bringing on 3 or 4 developers that can give a good push to this out of the gate and get the initial product done. So the main things that need to be done are we have to polish up the editing experience and make it a viable editing experience. And so that, there's a decent amount of work to do there, but we do have some existing code for that. And then the other major thing is it has to be able to connect, right? It's got to be able to connect to GitHub and suck in the documents and store them locally somehow, and then be able to take any markdown files it finds and then graft, sort of about mapping documents that can come from 2 places, mapping documents that could be internally authored and mapping documents that could be coming from your source code tree, and trying to figure out a sensible mapping of the URLs onto those documents and bringing those in and then showing them in a single unified environment. So there's some work to do there, but that's not about authoring, right? That's just about, we just need to connect, use the APIs or the Git protocol or whatever, bring those files in so we have access to them from our system, and then creating that mapping. Say I want that document to show up there in the document tree, and I want to map it to that URL, right? So that's sort of the work that needs to be done. So, but software always takes longer, right? I mean, it always takes longer. So we'll see.
There's always something you're not thinking of.
So that'll be there will be tons and tons and tons of functionality that comes out, post version 1.0, but that basic functionality of I can author documents internally, I can connect and map external documents and markdown files and have them show up in one environment. That's kind of time frame.
That's the minimum viable product.
Right, exactly. In lean startup terms, that's the minimum viable
there you
product.
go. Can I ask, what was you said you had some doubts about the lean startup methodology. What was that?
Well, actually, you mentioned my YouTube channel, and I kind of touch on that in a roundabout sort of way in one of my YouTube videos. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, which sort of kind of has an implication in it that maybe you should quit, right? And I'm kind of a believer more in sticking with something for the long term, right? Committing to something and finding a way to make it work. Whereas lean startup, I think, tends to be about early invalidation, right? Like instead of spending 2 years on something and finding out 2 years later that it's a loser, what if I could find out in a month that it was a loser, and then I could just jettison that and I could go on to something else, right? That's harder to do in practice than it sounds good in theory, but when you try to do that in practice, most ideas you're not going to know in a month whether it's a loser or a winner. You're going to have to stick with it longer than that to find out if it's a good product or not. And you're really going to kind of have to commit to it, right? And you're not going to be able to get away with just scratching out a quick a whiteboard or something like that and then showing it to people and then having people fawn all over you and say, oh God, where have you been all my life? Where do I send the check, right? I mean, that doesn't happen anymore, right? It takes longer than that. And so I think that there's a little bit of maybe a false hope in the lean startup that you can get by with cheap and that you can get by without having to really commit to something.
Sure.
And that's the main concern I have with lean startup. That
don't want to pivot too quickly.
It's not that easy. Yeah, if you pivot too early, you need to finish what you're currently working on, right? If you pivot before you finish what you're currently working on, if you can't finish anything, you're not going to finish your new idea that you pivoted to either, right? So you're just going to end up pivoting. You're going to wind up blowing around like a leaf in the wind. So you kind of got to commit to something and do it. That's what I feel.
One of my previous mentors used to tell me that if I was selling something B2B and I was taking a long time to develop it, I should acquire MOUs before finishing the product. I thought that was
What's an MOU?
Memorandum of Understanding. Basically saying if I develop something that meets these criteria, you'll sign on this line that it's not legally binding or anything like that. It's just you're putting your name on this, saying that you'll buy it if I make it. Like it's worth it to you that much. I thought that was a really clever way to get around because you're right. Like if you go ask 100 people if they like your idea, they're all gonna say yes because they don't want to like tell you your idea sucks. So I thought that was kind of a cool like put your money where your mouth is.
Are you familiar? Well, you're familiar with WP Engine.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely.
So WP Engine was founded by Jason Cohen. Jason Cohen. Yeah, exactly. Here in Austin. I've met Jason one time. I don't know him personally. I did meet him at a software development conference way back in 2007, back when I was doing the Buildbeat thing. We had a brief chat. He's done very well, and he does pretty much, as far as I know, reading his blog and things like that, kind of follows that methodology. I wish I could figure out a way to make that work for myself. I'm just not that good at doing that sort of pre-validation and presenting some kind of vision for what I'm trying to do.
It's tough because what you sell is so complex. Like it's really hard to describe to someone who isn't a developer. I mean, I guess that's your customer anyways, but I mean, it's a more difficult thing to explain than what WP Engine is.
Yeah. If you think about WP Engine, obviously, they've done awesome. What really is it? Is it because Jason did such a great job of pre-validating it? Or is it just that they just executed really, really well, right? Was it really like that awesome an idea? Weren't there like 8,000, other WordPress hosting companies out there at the time WP Engine got started? Is it really, that they just did such an awesome job of validating it? Or is it just that they did a really good job of executing on it?
Who knows?
Maybe it's both,
Probably.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what they did do really well, which makes me think they must have done some kind of really intelligent validation. They hit every pain point of hosting. Like, it sucks giving people access to your hosting.
Yep.
It sucks taking backups.
Yep.
It sucks getting an SSL certificate and installing it and, like, going through that whole process in cPanel.
Right.
Staging environments are a pain to set up. They really hit every pain point, which makes me think that they must have done some kind of like, hey, what are your biggest pain points as a WordPress developer? Just as a WordPress developer.
Yeah. I mean, they've done great. So,
but they definitely executed.
Yeah, they executed great. That execution is really underrated, right? Like, I mean, you've got to be able to execute. And so I've done that kind of validation as much as I conceivably can do it with this idea. I've been talking to people about this for years, and
this is like your life mission. It seems like
it pretty much is at this point. Yeah, and so so.
Kevin, I'm excited for you. This is going to be a pretty exciting chapter.
I think so. Looking forward to it.
All right, so we just did an hour. Kevin, where can people find you?
OpenSquiggly.com. Open and then Squiggly, SQUIGGLY.com. The name kind of comes from the left curly brace on the keyboard, which is oftentimes referred to developers in slang terms as Open Squiggly. And since it is a developer tool, I was trying to think of a name that would resonate with developers, right? And,
yep.
So Open Squiggly, it's a name, or it's a letter that developers tend to type a lot.
My team got it immediately.
Yeah. Squiggly, so great. I'm glad to hear that.
Cool. So you can sign up for early access on your website right now. So developers, you can be the first to try out version 1.0 when it's ready. Yep. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Max.
That was so much fun.
That was a blast. I enjoyed that a lot.
Thank you for doing that.
I think it went really well.
Yeah, me too.